Welcome to 10th or Tuesday, episode 8. My name is Michael Boldin with my co-host here, Mike Maharrey. Hi, Mike.
Greetings.
Awesome. Last week on episode 7, we gave the introduction to nullification season. Mike, you talked about why we call it that, and we mentioned that we are covering close to 200 bills to reject federal power or expand liberty on a state and local level. And we're now actually up to about 250. I'm sure we're probably actually getting close to or over that number that we're tracking right now. And at the end of last week, I mentioned that I wanted to talk with you about this kind of response we've been getting from people that, hey, look, you don't need to worry about gun control anymore because the Republicans are in charge and Donald Trump is an NRA-backed president. So we don't have to worry about any kind of federal gun control anymore. That stuff's all fixed. And I want to talk about that pretty considerably and kind of go over some bills that we're looking at right now on the state level. But before that, I just want to mention a few of the other reports that we've actually added to the site since last week's show. And just kind of quick fire, I've got a few that I thought were really good. Alaska bill would legalize raw milk sales, which is an important step to nullifying this major federal prohibition scheme. They think that they can, Mike, as you've reported so many times, they can actually ban interstate and intrastate commerce, right?
Right. Yeah. The FDA goes way beyond, what you would think it would even try to. But I guess the federal government's so used to going way beyond what it can do that it doesn't even pause anymore. But I really like these raw milk bills because all they do is legalize something within the state. And it's kind of like the marijuana and hemp. It removes a layer of law. It removes a layer of restriction, and it encourages the market. And, if you really think about it, if all 50 states have a robust raw milk market within the state, it doesn't even matter as far as interstate commerce goes because, it's not necessary. Everybody's got the markets within their own state. So you could almost do away with that regulation just by legalizing it within the state and make the intrastate work, and interstate doesn't really matter all that much.
Yeah, when you get down to it, the more that you advance liberty on a state or a local level, the more difficult it is for the feds to restrict those rights. So that's exactly it's a good blueprint as well. So a couple other bills. Mississippi would, with a new legislation, would end all state cooperation with Obamacare. We reported last week about a Connecticut bill that would do the same. There's going to be a few more states that we should see some legislation like that soon. New Hampshire bills would prohibit warrantless stingray spying, which is a big deal, and a Montana bill would reject or set the foundation to reject some federal gun control. And that, I think, is our segue. But before we go into talking about the gun control issue, I want to remind people that if you are not getting our newsletter either weekly or daily, make sure you go over to 10thamendmentcenter.com/register so you can get the updates. We're posting a lot of stuff, sometimes 10, 15 reports a day. And even if you're just skimming through them, you can kind of get an update on what's going on either in your state or elsewhere. But moving forward, Mike, let's talk about gun control. So we've seen a few states with legislators filing bills to reject federal gun control, and then specifically federal gun control, and then a couple other categories that we're actually monitoring as well to advance the right to keep and bear arms. And we've gotten some people giving us feedback, like I mentioned, hey, we don't need to worry about that anymore. There's Rick in Oklahoma said, hey, the Second Amendment is now active on the 20th. Tony in Wyoming says, thankfully, all our problems are going to be over in a week. So we don't have anything to worry about, supposedly. I mean, it's pretty laughable. Even if Donald Trump were the perfect constitutional president, there's only so much one man or one woman can actually do to overturn or turn back the clock on 100 plus years of unconstitutional federal action. And the founders are very clear. They don't want us to rely on the goodness of one person to protect our liberty.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's also an extremely myopic and short-sighted view. It's not like Donald Trump's going to be president for the rest of eternity.
Right.
I hope not. I mean, that's not, 4 years, maybe 8 years, and then you've got a new administration, and who knows what that administration will look like. So even if the Trump administration is extremely friendly towards the right to keep and bear arms, there's no guarantee that the next administration is going to follow that same pathway. So we need to establish these principles now so that they're set in foundation. So no matter what any president does, the right to keep and bear arms is being protected, and the federal government is being challenged when it tries to overstep those bounds. And quite frankly, between me and you and all of our wonderful viewers, I'm not convinced that Donald Trump will necessarily be all that great on guns. He's said some things about assault rifle bans in the past that kind of make you scratch your head a little bit. And, I think he's primarily, more than anything, pragmatic. And if the situation turns and something happens, who knows what it'll do. So we definitely want to establish these principles. And I don't understand. I can't even wrap my head around the mentality of, just everything's good now because this guy's here.
It's not uncommon, unfortunately. I mean, I don't think this is it's not the common or the majority of our supporters saying this, but we do hear it pretty regularly. Hey, we should either wait and see. Let's let the Congress do their thing. Republicans are in charge, and I think that is actually extremely dangerous. In fact, it's almost taking the precedent or taking the idea that there is no gun control as long as it isn't new. I mean, it's almost like forgetting. It's forgetting that 1934 ever existed, the National Firearms Act, 1968 the Gun Control Act, 1986. I think it's just an amended version of 68. Basically, we've got 80 some odd years of federal gun control that is currently on the books. And if we're just saying, hey, that's okay, then certainly we don't believe in the right to keep and bear arms as the founders did.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's almost an assumption that everything's good now, and obviously it's not. I think they're saying as long as things don't get worse, and I think it's already bad enough as it is. And that's why I think it's even more important, because as we see the pendulum swing back and forth and who's in charge in Washington, D.C., I don't actually expect the Republican Congress or Donald Trump or even maybe the ATF under him to actually work to make things, to add things on the books that's already there. I really don't expect that to happen, but maybe it will. Who knows? Maybe the ATF will kind of go even more rogue. They shouldn't exist in the first place, but maybe they'll continue to do what they do and try to make things worse. And who knows? But certainly there's a lot of stuff on the books now, and that makes it even more essential for states to say, and we don't hear anything from Congress saying, like, we're going to repeal the National Firearms Act, for example. No one's talking about this. So certainly if we really want to support the right to keep and bear arms and the original meaning of the Second Amendment, we want to see states saying, hey, we're not going to participate in these federal gun control schemes anymore. And a number of states, Mike, you've been doing a lot of blogging on this, have taken, are considering legislation to take a very first foundational step. We've got Texas, Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, Mississippi. I've got Indiana on there twice. Maybe they've got a really good bill. But tell us a little more about those bills. Well, most of these bills that we're seeing from the states that you mentioned are basically provisions that would ban enforcement of any future federal gun control. So any federal gun laws, it's usually worded laws relating to firearms, firearm accessories, ammunition, et cetera, that is issued or promulgated after the date of the enactment of the bill would not be enforced by state and local law enforcement. So it doesn't attempt to block federal enforcement. It's not going to, try to arrest an ATF agent, but it would set the precedent that the state and local governments, police departments would not assist in any way with the enforcement of these gun laws. And that would include spending money or using local or state assets. So no cooperation at all, hands completely off. This is a great first step towards nullifying these types of acts in effect. Law will still be on the books. Like we said, the federal government can still try to enforce their law, but with a rather limited number of ATF agencies, it's absolutely impossible for the federal government to maintain a gun control law without state and local cooperation. And the more states that pull that, then the better off we are.
this is where the question comes in, and we hear from people, hey, you're even saying you're not expecting any new stuff to come from Washington, D.C., or it's very unlikely. And I guess we can revisit this in a couple of years and see whether we were right or wrong. But they say, well, what's the point? Why are you only addressing new? Well, first of all, I would say there's a few reasons. First of all, in most of these states, even though a vast majority of them are Republican states, Republican-controlled legislatures or governors, or both in many situations, they're mostly all awful. They're really weak. They aren't willing to do the right thing in many situations. They're afraid. They don't know much about the Constitution. They don't really understand Supreme Court precedent under the anti-commandeering doctrine. And that's why something like this, which is basically a no-risk bill for legislators, it should be easy for them to pass, is good. It sets the foundation. It gets people talking, and it gets people realizing, well, wait a second. So a state can make a decision about deciding to help the feds or not enforce particular things, and it gets into the public conscious that this is an option. So I think that's the foundational first step. You establish this as part of the state's role, duty, prerogative. And then from there, once this becomes accepted as being done, then they can take on other issues as well.
Right. And it's extremely important, not only in the mind of the public, but in the mind of the legislators, because like you said, a lot of them don't understand or don't know the legal basis. And by passing this first foundational law, it sets the precedent. Yes, we can refuse to cooperate. We can refuse to assist in enforcement. We can refuse to allow our assets to be used in this situation. And so the next thing that comes down the line that may be more relevant right this minute, the precedent has already been set. We don't have to argue about that anymore. We know that anti-commandeering doctrine, the federal government cannot require state and local agencies, state and local resources to be used for enforcement of their laws. They have to do it themselves. Once that is established, we can extend this principle beyond gun control to all kinds of different issues. So it's very important to establish this foundational right and responsibility of a state.
Well, certainly, if there was a state or any legislators that were willing to use this same method on the NFA or the Gun Control Act of 1968, we would certainly report on it. We would certainly be telling you about it, and we would be supportive of that effort. But it's very unlikely that the legalese type politicians that run the committees are willing to consider this type of legislation. So I think at least the feedback we get is that this is a strategic move, again, just to establish the precedent, establish the principle. Just like back in, if people remember, in the mid-'90s, and then again in 2007 and 2008, a number of states passed what were known as 10th Amendment resolutions. It established, these were just non-binding statements of intent that were passed in a number of states around the country saying that the federal government can only do that which has been delegated to it. And this is a notice to cease and desist going beyond that. And this was a big deal at the time. And now to think of some kind of a resolution now seems almost like, well, what's the point? Because we've gone this whole movement has gone so much further than that. But there are still times when either a resolution or a legal foundational step is very important. And we are very supportive of these efforts in like Texas, Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, and Mike, I don't know if you know of any others that are on deck next.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think those are the ones that I've written. There might be a couple more that are still on the queue. So
another thing that I want to talk about is two other kind of directions that we're watching on how to support the right to keep and bear arms on a state level, and at the same time create kind of a bulwark or a foundation for a wall. We'll say we're going to build that wall around between the states and local communities versus the federal government. And one I think is the most important is the constitutional carry issue. Although we can talk about this another time, I think that's actually a misnamed piece of legislation, but it's a very popular term, and that's what the market wants to call it. And there are bills in Indiana, Kentucky, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Texas, New Mexico, and probably somewhere else that we haven't caught up on yet that are passing or looking at passing legislation to allow people to carry either openly or concealed without having to pay for a license.
Right. And this is another one of those bills that from our perspective, when you start talking about federal gun control, it doesn't really have anything directly to do with federal gun control, but it creates a gun-friendly climate in the state. And it creates an environment where more people are going to be carrying guns. And when you have that environment, it's going to make it much more difficult for the federal government to enact gun control. So we create a gun-friendly environment with this kind of legislation. And it's kind of like we were talking about with the raw milk a few minutes ago. It creates a market. And as that market grows, it becomes much more difficult to regulate it. It takes on a life of its own. So that's what we expect will happen as more and more states adopt this permitless carry. It will create a stronger gun environment, a stronger quote-unquote market for firearms. And as a result, it's going to be much more difficult for the federal government to come along later and start instituting different types of gun control legislation. So it makes fertile ground for the work that we're doing to protect the Second Amendment and keep it in force.
Again, the more liberty that people are exercising, the more that people exercise their rights on a state and local level, the more difficult it is for the federal government to restrict that right, because it just becomes more popular on the state and local level to reject that idea. So again, I always can turn back to weed. People look at, is it 30 some odd states now, 28 states that are rejecting in some level or to some degree federal prohibition on this plant. And before 1996, when California passed Prop 215, there were people already smoking, buying, selling, consuming marijuana. They were growing it, and it was illegal to do so. And then once the law was passed, it was that much easier to implement. So in places where people want to reject federal gun control, you have to first create, like you said, Mike, a fertile ground on a state and local level where it's far more acceptable and people can watch and see that the world doesn't come to an end when people have more freedom. And back in the earlier days of the 10th Amendment Center, we used to get a lot of resistance from people on the right on the marijuana issue. And I think over the years, we've seen that almost fall apart in many circles where they're saying, okay, even if I don't approve of it, this is a states' rights or a 10th Amendment issue. And, if these people want to do this, I don't agree with their choice. I'm not going to do it myself. But we can teach people with the same method on other issues. And I think constitutional carry is a very, very good way to do that, because the more people that are actually carrying their firearm, the more people are going to learn to not be afraid of it, except unless, it's a self-defense situation. I mean, you're supposed to be afraid of it. That's the point. But you're not, you just see a gun. I was watching this TV show on NBC called Emerald City. It's a remake of Wizard of Oz. And they had this scene. It was total propaganda. I even had to pause it. Like, that is propaganda. They basically, this guy in Ozland, he had his first experience seeing a gun, and his response was, no one should be carrying this, and that's a mentality. People are very afraid. I was raised in a gunless lifestyle for my entire childhood. So when I first would see firearms, I was frightened of them, or I thought someone who had it was automatically a bad guy. And I think the more that our neighbors and our friends and family members are carrying it out in the open, the less likely people will have that same mentality.
Right. And I can, I had the exact opposite background. My father always had a gun in the car. He always had firearms. He taught me to respect the same. And so to me, and of course I grew up in Kentucky, so there's that too. But so for me, it's very natural to see firearms, to see people with guns. And in Kentucky, you walk into a restaurant, you see somebody carrying. Most people don't even give it a second of thought.
You mean people aren't just getting shot all the time at those restaurants?
Well, no, strangely not. Now,
Well, I think that's what would happen if people would actually go to a restaurant and then you see people with guns and then you realize that no one is getting shot. Eventually you learn, especially you bring your kids out for pizza, eventually they're going to see like, oh, okay, these people are protecting themselves. And it's not something to be feared. And that's a big part of the whole process. The more that people exercise their rights, they say use them or lose them. And I think this is a big part of that.
And we've seen that with marijuana as well. I think if you go, you look at states like Colorado and California where they've had legalized marijuana and the other states, you realize that, no, the world hasn't come to an end. Everybody's not stoned, and
maybe.
Well, they were stoned before. People realize that the law changing has not made a significant impact on their lives, and it becomes much more acceptable.
Right. And so there's a third category. I don't even know what to put this. So we have the two different categories of efforts to expand the right to keep and bear arms or protect it on a state and local level. That's one, setting the foundation to reject federal gun control, or if we hear of any legislators filing a bill to actually reject something specifically, well, maybe we're going to get into that. Then we have a constitutional carry, which I think is extremely important. And then others. For example, there's a bill in Maine that you reported on, Mike, about preventing the state from facilitating a gun owner registry. Is that right? How does that one go?
I haven't written that one yet.
Oh, I sent it to you. Okay, sorry.
It's on my queue to write. Actually,
okay.
It's probably on the list for today, but I haven't gotten to that one yet.
Okay, well, I mean, I like the idea of, you would hear through previous administration in recent years, they wanted to, keep track of everybody with a gun. The more that they have the information, the easier it's going to be for them to do this. So there's this bill, I think it's LD9 in Maine. It would prevent the state from taking steps to create a registry on a state level. So then if the state isn't creating it, then they don't have anything to share with the feds, anyone in Washington, D.C., and then it becomes more difficult. That's a very kind of good foundational step in Maine. And then, for example, you talked about spending using state resources. There's a bill, I know you reported on this one, Senator Dom in Oklahoma filed a bill, I think it's Senate Bill 65, if I recall right, about spending resources. Why don't you explain it? You'll do it better than me.
Well, basically, the bill prohibits any state agency from spending state monies or resources, money primarily, to propagandize for gun control. And I actually talked to the senator, and he kind of explained to me what happens. He said you'll have, for instance, universities. They don't want, a lot of university administrators don't want to have guns carried on their campus. So they will actually spend state money to lobby against gun measures that would loosen those types of restrictions. So they're trying to advance their interest using state money at the expense of your right to carry a firearm.
Also like University of Oklahoma or Oklahoma
exactly.
State.
So you might have the administration at the University of Oklahoma actually lobbying against a gun bill or lobbying against looser gun regulations in general because of what they specifically want on campus. And he said cities will do this too. You'll get a city that has a council that wants to have more restrictive gun laws, so they will actually pay lobbyists with city money or state money to lobby against legislation that's coming through that would limit their ability to enforce gun laws. So this would cut all of that off. No state agency, no city council would be able to spend any money to advance the cause of gun control. So,
I like it a lot. So one other bill that we got to cover just briefly, and I'd like to talk about it maybe more in the future as well, is a bill in Montana dealing with gun control at federal post offices.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite bills that I've seen because it's so specific. So basically what it would do, it would authorize people in Montana to carry firearms in a post office or on postal service property. And of course, federal law prohibits this. Now, people need to understand when they see this, this will not protect you from federal prosecution. So if the federal government arrested you and prosecuted you, that's state law, that state authorization is not going to do a thing to help you. The federal courts are going to ignore it. But the important part of this bill is it prohibits state and local police from enforcing any law against carrying on postal service. So let's say some guy at the post office sees somebody in there with a firearm. He calls the police. Well, the police aren't going to make an arrest.
They won't show up.
Yeah, they would have to call the ATF or the FBI. A federal agency would have to make a federal arrest. Well, this is going to be very, very difficult. And
I don't know how many ATF agents there are in Kalispell, but
right, and how many, or if they're going to have time to come show up at the post office before you walk out the door, because it's not like the post.
So the bill, Mike, is House Bill 246 from Representative Randy Brodell. I think Brodell out of Kalispell in Montana, and again the key is, like you said, this isn't necessarily going to get the state police to come in and go stop the ATF from or maybe even arrest a postal office worker. I mean, we're not trying to get a standoff here. We're basically just trying to encourage people to exercise their rights whether the federal government wants them to or not. And when a lot of people do it, it's just going to overwhelm the system. There's no way for them to stop people from doing this. You create a new status quo, and maybe some of the local people that work at those post offices are going to like the idea of this happening anyways.
Yeah, well, it's Montana, so I can picture some of them showing up to work with their firearms. And, this is just like marijuana. It removes a layer of state law. It removes the layer of state enforcement. It leaves it to the federal government to enforce itself. People are willing to take the very small risk of federal enforcement and exercise their rights anyway. If enough people do it, it's going to overwhelm the system and nullify this unconstitutional law. And in fact, it is an unconstitutional law. There's actually a legal brief already attached to it, and they're saying, well, the federal government has the right to make rules and regulations for its own property, but the Second Amendment prohibits it from infringing on the right to keep and bear arms, no matter what it's doing. So
right. So this is a very creative thing that's been filed as House Bill 246 in Montana. I'd like to see more of them. Last year, or maybe the year before, there was a bill in Louisiana that said they were going to legalize, I guess they called them sawed-off shotguns, and then someone educated me on the proper terminology there. I forget how that all kind of goes together. But these are very creative ways to actually help advance the right to keep and bear arms on a state level. Even though the federal government is unwilling to kind of back down from where they have been for so many decades.
And that's a perfect example of unconstitutional federal gun control that exists right now today.
Oh, yeah. Supposedly we have no one's trying to take our guns or restrict our right to keep and bear arms.
Right.
Even I've had a friend tell me that recently. Nothing to worry about. But I think we're over the limit on time again this week. Mike, thank you so much for spending some time explaining these things for us. Thank you so much for watching. If you support the work that we're doing here, make sure you subscribe as a monthly member. You can go as little as $2 a month. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And that is extremely important for us to be able to continue doing this kind of work and taking things to the next level. We'll be back next week. Thank you for watching.